everyone. Welcome back to the Miss Education Podcast. I'm your host, Victoria, and this is the podcast where we talk all things education, meaning schools, school systems, teaching, communities, and a place where we get to dissect challenges, futuristic ideas, and other social justice matters. I'm really excited to introduce my guest today. Jennifer Cheatham is a senior lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a co-chair of the Public Education Leadership Project and the faculty co-chair of the Education, Leadership, Organizations, and Entrepreneurship Program, ELOE. Jennifer's focus has been on leading for equity and transformational change in urban school districts. She began her career as an 8th grade English teacher and has then served as a superintendent, chief of instruction, chief area officer, executive director of curriculum, and a coach and professional developer. So welcome, Jen, and thank you for joining the podcast.
I'm thrilled to be here, Victoria. This is wonderful.
Awesome. And I wanted to introduce how I know you. So I was at Hugsy in the 1-year program in the EPA program, Education Policy and Analysis. And of course, the school year was done, but then there's this term called the May term. And everyone said, you should just relax. Don't take a course. Just chill. You've been doing a lot for 9 months. But then I saw your course. I think it was titled Equity Focused Leadership or Equity Focused Entry to Leadership. And I was like, wait, that sounds really cool. And that was kind of what I wanted to do after Hugsy, re-enter school systems, re-enter possibly as an administrator or some type of leadership position. And I thought this would set me up really well. I really want to take this course. And then once I took the course, it was amazing. It was only 1 week long, but it was honestly one of my top courses that I took at Hugsy, I loved it. So thank you for the course, but then I also got to meet you and have the connection with you. So that was amazing.
Well, I remember that week. Wow.
Yeah.
It was so fun having you there, Victoria. And yeah, that course was meant to be kind of a launching pad for people who were getting ready to re-enter the field and how to do so in a way that was human-centered and equity-focused.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask how you even started focusing on entry to leadership. I know that you have the book, right? The Entry to Leadership book and workbook. Is this something that you discovered when you were doing your doctorate program? Is it something you thought about when you were a teacher or superintendent? How did you start thinking about entry to leadership as your focus for
That is a great question. I definitely first started thinking about it deeply during my doctoral work at Harvard. And in the program that I was in, it was called the Urban Superintendent's Program. It doesn't exist anymore. But one thing that we all had to do was to get to work with a guy named Barry Gentz, who mostly helped us learn how to have difficult conversations. It was like a module, which was spectacular. But he also encouraged us to use a structured leadership entry process when getting back into the field. And a lot of people in education may be familiar with Barry's work. You can still buy his workbook online. I think I had you all use it and read it in class. But his approach, appreciated, was all about entering into your role with a stance, an inquiry stance. He used to say things like it was important. He used to tell us that you should hit the ground learning instead of hitting the ground running. And it was wonderful. In fact, he personally coached me into my first major leadership role, which is when I was the executive director of CNI in San Diego. I remember talking to him on the phone. I was pacing around in the backyard trying to think about how to enter into this role. Wow. So I'm forever thankful to him. And I use that structured leadership entry approach in every role that I ever took after that. I've even took a structured leadership entry role into the role that I have now at HBSC. But every time it was different, of course, depending on my role in relationship to the context that I was entering into. And through experience, and of course, supporting and coaching other leaders that I was working with over those years, I learned that there were nuances, especially for equity focused leaders, right? People who wanted to get something done for the kids who were situated furthest from opportunity and their families, and for women and leaders of color. There were ways that we needed to work a little differently. And that is what got me wanting to do kind of the next level of work on leadership entry, which is why we wrote the book, Entry Planning for Equity Focused Leaders, which is where we really dive in to these nuances and through a series of case studies on women, leaders of color, and different kinds of leaders, not just here in the US, but around the world.
Thank you. Thank you. And I actually, two different examples. When I was working in Boston, I actually gifted my supervisor, or technically my director, your book, like the Entry to Leadership, because he had just transitioned into that role very suddenly. He was the same position as me, and then they were like, "We need a director. You're now in this spot." And so, I gave him the book and he said it was amazing. He's like, this is exactly what I needed in terms of how to enter as a leader in that role. It was a small team. It was 3 people in this team, but even then, right, there was a way to kind of move himself into that leadership position that he appreciated. And recently for myself in a job interview, I actually used that example, not the exact words of hit the ground learning, but I said, if I were to enter here, I would come in as a listening leader. I think that we talked about the listening leader, right? Versus, okay, here's my plans. We're all doing what I said because I know best. I don't know best. So I wanted to say, I made it clear to them that if I came in, I'm coming in a somewhat leadership position, and I want to learn. Like, let me sit back, take notes, listen to what people have been saying, listen to what the field is saying, because I'm not from that sector exactly. So I think that they really appreciated that.
I love hearing that. And I love what you said about your friend and colleague, the one on the 3-person team, because it's always applicable, whether you got promoted from within, or if you're going into a whole new place, if you have no direct reports, if you have 10, right? Intentional leadership entry does matter, no matter what.
I even thought about how I can go back to the presentation I did for your class and maybe adapt that and think about my presentation for a next role that I might be in. I just thought about that. I was like, how could I do a presentation of my entry to this organization? Yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah, that's the other key, is not just structuring it for yourself. That's important to keep you, kind of sane during entry, right? Having a plan always helps personally, but when you can share it with others, it helps them help you too. Yeah.
In schooling, I feel like, or at least in school districts, sometimes there are polarizing moments or things that happen where there's turnover. Maybe the principal needs to leave for, just taking care of themselves right now. And there's different things that happen in school. So I wonder if, what's your idea of the concept of entry to leadership, but especially in polarizing times? How can leaders enter without feeling like they're backed into a corner, without feeling like they're isolating certain people, without feeling like people are already against them? How can they enter into a situation that feels a bit, there's a lot of tension, but they want to do good for the community?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're mentioning that, Victoria, because things are very polarized and polarizing in public education today, and we should talk about that. And relatedly, there is often not only community trauma that a new leader will need to understand and work through. Given the pandemic, this is, the norm in many communities. But there's often organizational trauma too, right? What if the previous principal was let go in terrible circumstances, or who knows what the situation may be? But when you enter that trauma doesn't go away. It's there, and it often will
Right.
come to the surface. So I often, and one of the ways that we think about leadership entry in our book and how we talk about it in the book is that it offers this
Mm-hmm.
opportunity for healing, right? For bringing people together. So, I mean, I would highlight a few things. First of all, given how difficult things are in schools these days, every leader needs to practice being centered, being present, of course, being cognizant, right, of what's happening around them. But there are some specific kind of ways of entering that we emphasize in our work that I think are especially important during these polarizing times. The first idea that I would emphasize is that in typical leadership entry, leaders have done a lot of work understanding the community context, right? Like what's happening around here. And that's important, but it's just as important for the leader
Mm.
to look inward, right? And to really think like, is this the right community for me? You know, I mean, before you've even taken the job, right? It's important to look inward as well as outward. How, given what you know about the community and what you know about yourself, right? What are your perspectives on what's happening there? What strengths might you offer? What biases might you have? How might you be perceived, right? Like having this kind of internal dialogue with yourself before and as you're entering, checking in with yourself will help you remain centered, right, in the role, which is really key. I would also emphasize that usually when a person enters into a role, they do some thinking about their core values. They may communicate those core
Yes.
values. I think we did
Yes.
that in class. Very important. That also will keep you centered. But it's just as important to get an understanding in those first weeks and months on the job of the communities.
Right.
And it is where your community's values and your own really overlap. Like that is where you can really
Right.
do things with some determination
Right.
and tenacity, right? Like you want to figure out where we can all come together on things. That way, again, when things are difficult, you can reference those
Right.
shared values, right? Helps you stay really centered during this turbulent and polarizing time. Another thing I would emphasize is um, often we've been trained as leaders to come in and like diagnose the problem. You got to figure out what's wrong here and what needs to be fixed. And in our work, we actually try to help people do something different. We want the leader to develop a stronger shared vision of what's possible before diagnosing problems, and that will help the leader bring together a larger swath of people, right, who are all together trying to uh, make something beautiful happen. I can't tell you enough how important it is right now to draw on community values and to paint a picture that more people can get behind. Last couple of quick points is when you enter into a new role and you're doing your listening and learning, which you talked about, Victoria, you often at some point share back with your team, with your school, with your community, what it is that you've learned. And that's always important. It's important to be transparent. But in our work, especially in these polarizing times, how you talk matters, right? You need to inspire hope, right? Again, help to paint the picture of what it is that we all want for our children, for example. You also need to be able to speak hard truths. But these days, I think the key is to like avoid these
Yeah.
trigger words, like use more descriptive language about the problems. You can't avoid talking about problems, especially problems that are rooted in racism. They're real. We have to be able to talk about them, but we can avoid these trigger words, I think, and be more descriptive about it. And then lastly, I think in these polarizing times, it's not just about taking action, which is what leaders have often been taught to do as a result of what they've learned during leadership entry. Action certainly can be good, but what you're really trying to do is galvanize change. Like as you're going through your leadership entry, you are finding your allies, you're building relationships. Right? These are the people that can help you make collaborative efforts, right, for positive change, as opposed to simply taking action as a result of what you've learned. There are a lot of these shifts that are necessary if we're going to be the kinds of leaders who can navigate polarization.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about bringing people together. What do you
No,
think,
thank
Victoria?
you.
Does that resonate?
No, that was great. I was like, let me hold on to these points. Oh, wait, that was a great point. That was a great point. I agree with the values. Like if I say, here are my 5 top values, and then the community has 5 different values, we have to kind of find this moment of, am I the right person? Maybe you need someone else. You want to be authentic about your values, right? You don't want to just say, oh, you really value joy, me too, because then it's not going to be authentic, right? And then also the fact that you said people are always trying to diagnose the problem, but what if you kind of brought a mirror back to the community, but it's like a positive mirror. It's like, here's actually all the things I see going right here. So they're able to say, people look at this community as a failing school district. They look at this community as, this is all you are. And then if you say, wait, I actually see these like 10 strengths, I feel like that could be really uplifting to communities as well. And then I also liked what you said about the being descriptive about the problem, because there are a lot of times where I was actually speaking with, I don't know if you know Asher Miller.
Sure.
Yes.
Yes, I do.
So he
Yeah.
works at Castle.
Okay.
And I was talking with him about social and emotional learning. And he said a lot of times when he speaks with people who are kind of trying to fight social emotional learning, they actually agree with social and emotional learning. But then there's like this moment where he's like, okay, so what are we talking about right now? But being descriptive, like you said, sometimes they don't like the acronym. We don't like SEL. We just don't want it. We don't like 3-letter acronyms. It's a waste of time. But then when they talk about, wanting your student or your child to be communicating in the classroom effectively, you want them to be kind to other students. They're like, of course we want that.
Right.
That makes sense to us. So there's kind of that moment where you describe what you're doing and you say, hey, we're working on learning skills. In addition to math, we're working on learning skills. And people do kind of hear you out, and they kind of agree with you that you're at this like middle ground where you're able to come together and say, oh, we're actually fighting for the same thing. Although the wording gets people, like you said, triggered, right? If I'm a kindergarten teacher and all of a sudden I bring up critical race theory, there's going to be maybe an issue with certain parents. Although if you told your parents, hey, as kindergarten students, I want them to love and respect everyone, no matter what they look like, they'd say, oh, that sounds like a lovely idea, because they do want that at the end of the day, right? So there's like that descriptive element that works. And also for leaders, not just for teachers, but for leaders as well. And then there was one last point that you said that now it's leaving my mind, but there was a point that I really liked as your final point.
We were talking about galvanizing change.
Yes.
Like it's not just about the action steps, but bringing people along with you.
And then I wanted to ask you about, right now we see a lot of public education polarizing times. I'm from Canada. It's the same here. It's not as intense, I'd say, as in the US. The US is a bit more intense from what I've both seen with my own eyes and heard on the news. But is this new? Like, is this kind of public outcry about certain issues new, or has it been happening for decades with different issues?
I'm very curious about what you're seeing in Canada. So listen to this and tell me how it connects with what you're seeing there. But I would say that there have what's direct challenges to equity focused work, right? Which is work aimed at improving outcomes and access for students positioned the furthest from opportunity. Like, let's just say that that's the definition. That is not new. That has always been, since the beginning of public schooling. That has been the case. And I don't think the ugliness is new, right? We've seen that in waves. I mean, look at what has happened during desegregation efforts, for example, right? After Brown was passed, right? We've seen these waves of ugliness and kind of racialized, not just ugliness, but violence, right? Related to efforts to improve schools. So that is also not new. I think what's interesting about today's context, I've been finding myself thinking about this a lot. I've been doing some work on political leadership in education lately, Victoria, which I should fill you in on. But what's interesting to me is that what's different now are the demographic shifts that have happened in the U.S. over the last 20 years, right? The population of white people, I'll talk about schools specifically. In public schools, the white population has fallen pretty dramatically. I mean, it was at 61% back in 2000, and now it's like 47. Well, in 2018, it was 47%, and it's going even further down, projected by 2030. In 2014, students of color became the majority in public schools. But what's even more interesting is much of that is happening in the suburbs, right? Which was this refuge for white families for so long, right? And now most of the nation's school children attend schools in the suburbs. And now the majority of suburban school students are students of color. So there's something of, right, it's definitely, this context is related to the kind of polarization we're seeing today. In addition to the changing demographic, well, let me say this. I think, based on my personal experience working with educators across the country, that many school districts, including these school districts in the suburbs, have been trying to respond to those changing demographics, right? Rightly so. They have been trying to enhance their curricula. They have been trying to introduce new ways to attract and retain teachers of color. They've been trying to interrogate their policies, right? They've been trying to do these really good things. Not perfectly, right? Like, we could talk all about that too, but there's been an effort. And then meanwhile, let me just layer this on. So we've got the demographics, schools responding to those changing demographics. And then we've got the political parties that have also been changing over these past 20 years. The Republican Party has been changing. It's characterized more and more. There was a Pew Research study about this that talked about that it's more and more characterized by white men without a college degree, people living in more rural communities, people who attend religious services, right? That's just descriptive. And the Democratic Party has been kind of increasingly different, right? Black women, residents of urban communities, right? You get the idea, people who aren't affiliated with a religion. So if you take all that together, right, the changing demographics, the partisan, or the parties that have been changing, and the way schools have been trying to address it, it makes sense that we might be having the conflicts that we're having today. Like, it's worth knowing there's a reason. Our country is changing. So what feels new right now is the extreme partisanship, that partisan politics are now very present at the local level, which has not been the case in the past. School boards have become very partisan in many places, which is not typical. There's a lot of misinformation out in the world that is being put out there, pumped into into our minds and ears through people who are engaged in big P politics, right? Uh, and their strategy is to create doubt among community
Right.
members and to create a chilling effect among
Right.
educators, right? Both of which is like that's been quite effective. The big problem is that for leaders in education, our job, part of it has to be to discern between the big P political strategy that's at play, which is all about
Right.
getting votes, instilling fear and getting votes, and the real people, the parents, for example, who have true, real concerns about what's being
Right.
taught in
Right.
schools. You know, like Victoria, this is going to be very interesting. There was, oh God, I'm blanking on, I think it was Julie Marsh and a colleague. I can't remember who exactly did the study, but they recently were looking in the state of California at parent perspectives on a variety of issues being taught in schools. And while there were differences along party lines, most parents across both parties had real concerns about certain things being taught
Right.
at the elementary level, like, issues related to gender
Right.
and sexuality. So, right? Like, so as a leader, how do you discern between the stuff that's just political
Right.
battle? It's not real. It doesn't actually represent the real views of your parents. And the things that the parents in your community do
Right.
have real concerns about, the things that you really do
Yeah.
need to listen to. This all does go back to leadership entry to some perspective, because that's a real opportunity to figure out what people really are concerned about, to give them good information about what's happening, um, and still be open to receiving
Mm-hmm.
the real concerns. There's this discernment that we have to engage in. I
No,
don't know,
thank
that was
you.
a
Thank you.
lot.
There
There's
is.
so much to talk
I think
about.
the things I hear, for example, we have, I don't know if your mayors have political parties. Do your mayors have political? They do. Okay, here we have
Yeah,
mayors don't have a political party. So there's a part of it that doesn't feel like there's a lot of politics at the local level because all mayors across Canada are
interesting.
nonpartisan. I mean, they may have an affiliation that you may know about, but it's not relevant to the voting for mayors. And I think that is helpful in some cases because you're just trying to get to know what the community needs versus what political strategy is being used in that specific town or city. Education does come up with the politics though, and I think the parties, you were saying how there's now a certain view of the Republican, there's a certain person who's representing the Democrats. It is like that here. There's still a bit of, I'd say, nuance. And we have more than two parties, we have five parties. And I mean, I would say
Yeah.
three are prominent. Four is, inching there. Five is a lot. But I'd say there's at least three parties that are talking and people are listening and people are talking about their ideas. And there is definitely a specific group. I'd say young millennial, Gen Z is more on the this party called the New Democratic Party. That's kind of like the face of that party, I'd say, more than the Liberal Party, which I'd say is like elder millennial, maybe Generation X. And then I'd say that the Conservative Party has actually a lot of people are in conservative Party in different demographics for different reasons.
Yep.
And it's very
Yep.
different than the US. It's not as focused on religion, I'd say. In the US, I feel like I notice a lot of the conservative or Republican rhetoric is related to Christianity or it's related to a specific religion. And here it doesn't have that connotation necessarily. There's a lot of people who are atheists or whatnot that are in the conservative party or vote conservative. And then another part that you said about the school, like, oh wait, I lost my thought. The school, the demographics in the community, it's the same here in that, our population of Canada, I don't know the demographics of white people in Canada versus, immigrants in the past 20 years. I'm sure it's changed, right? Even my neighborhood has changed
Yeah.
demographically. My school, though, like the school I went to when I was in elementary school, was very, very diverse. But then I have a lot of friends who are from different suburbs and their communities were not diverse. And they were mostly saying they went to school with mostly white people. And that was not my experience at all, just because of where I live. So it has changed. I agree, it's changed, and people are trying to respond to the issues. And at the same time, I actually did another podcast. My first podcast episode actually was on gender neutral bathrooms in schools, because there is a controversy about a new school that was built, but I think that they only built gender neutral bathrooms. And then there was a controversy around that because people were like, wait, like, whoa, right? It was kind of like this dramatic
Yeah.
shift. And I think there was maybe one single stall that you can, a single like locked bathroom door. And it kind of had this, I was reading the comments online on the news sources, and there's a part of the people on the news sources who just really are like anti-trans, right? Like we don't need this because these
Yeah.
people shouldn't exist. And then there are people who have, like you said, those real concerns, who are like, wait, but what if my daughter who wants to take her tampon to the
Right.
bathroom doesn't want to go in with a boy? And you're like, that's a great question, right? Because there's a nuance there that you haven't really addressed if you're the school leader. And then as the school leader, you have to think, did you talk to the
Yeah.
community about this? Because this is a brand new school. How did you just build this without asking the community what they needed? Which to that point is a real concern, right? There's a real concern there that
Yeah.
we can all appreciate and actually discuss and think about. It's not that if people have questions, they are anti-trans, but then there are people who are anti-trans because they have an issue with it, right? So there's that kind of moment you have.
It's so interesting that you say that, Victoria. Like it is about leaders. Like we are so well positioned to create spaces where we can have more
Yeah.
nuanced conversations, right? Like there are spaces that is not
Yeah.
where that's just impossible, right? At a public board meeting,
Yeah.
trying to have a nuanced
Yeah.
conversation there is likely very
Right.
difficult, if not impossible to do, which means we've got to create other spaces. I'll tell you that my son, who's about to turn 12, approached me recently wanting to have one of these
Yeah.
nuanced conversations. And he prefaced it by saying something like, and this is our household I would describe as
Yeah.
being pretty liberal generally. And he said, now, Mom, if I tried to have this conversation at school, I'd
Mm,
probably get canceled.
right.
That's how he started it. And then he went into
Right.
asking his
Right.
questions. Interesting,
Then he
right?
knows.
You know,
Yeah.
he knows.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's almost impossible to have these nuanced conversations,
Right.
even at
Right.
school these days.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
really
and I think there are some
challenging.
people who maybe just by virtue of their personality or the way that they can speak to people, they're able to have those conversations without the tension getting too high. But then there are some people who, because they have a specific bias or view, they put that into the discussion, and then people are like, wait, what's your opinion? And then it gets really, really heated versus let's just try and have this conversation. I'm not even going to put my opinion in there yet. But what do you think about this specific thing? Like, what do we think about the bathroom? Right? Like, what are the
Yeah,
nuances there? And, even in that case, it's like, I agree with having an option. I would love the option, there's gendered bathrooms because gender exists and we are still in a gendered world. And then there's the option to be in a neutral bathroom. There's the option to be in a single stall bathroom. And if you were building a brand new
yeah,
school and you have the resources to build whatever bathrooms you'd like, it seems like a no-brainer to me, but maybe I don't know exactly what the thought process was. And I understand the concern without calling everyone who's concerned, a certain ism or something like that.
right. Exactly, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yep,
Yeah.
I'm with you on that,
And I
Victoria.
also wanted to ask
Hmm.
about, because we were talking about a lot about leaders, but what can teachers do if they are leading the classroom? And we kind of discussed the descriptive aspect. Maybe you're talking to parents about an issue in the classroom, report cards, being descriptive with what you mean, not using buzzwords because people don't respond well to buzzwords. But what can teachers do as leaders? Maybe they're taking on the lead teacher role of a certain department. Maybe they're trying to speak to a parent community at parent teacher night, and there's some issue happening. What can teachers do as their kind of entry to leadership?
Um, you're reminding me, Victoria, that when we
Yeah.
had that week-long class, the one that you were in, that we did have at
Yeah.
least a few teachers
Yeah.
in the class. And I was so excited about that because teachers
Yeah.
are leaders and there's and they too need to be intentional about how they enter into a new role or a new grade level or a new classroom or a new school, so that they can build trust and relationship, including with parents, and their students, of course, and their colleagues. I think a few things come to mind. I mean, just like we were talking about before, teachers can practice centeredness too. And that has a lot to do with emotional intelligence. I think we talked about that in class, and which has a lot to do with empathic listening, but it also has to do with self-awareness, kind of knowing what your triggers are, kind of imagining the conversation in advance and planning forward. I mean, this can really help you stay centered. I mean, all that we know about emotional intelligence, I think, is very important for teachers as well. I do think that being present and visible for teachers has become even more important. I know everyone's exhausted and it's hard to find both the time and energy, but to the extent that teachers can present, be out there, be I don't know how to say it better. Like just to it's those like informal opportunities, to chat with parents or students, right, outside of the formal classroom, I think have become even more important, right? It's a trust building activity. When you have relationships with people, it's so much harder to be a jerk to one another, right? So I would be thinking about that. Try to go to the dance or try to go to, all those things. And of course, teachers do need to be cognizant, just like leaders, of what's happening in the bigger political arena. Like we have to be paying attention so that we can avoid the trigger words, so that we can avoid sharing our personal views on political hot topics. Right? It's important that we teach about controversial topics in the classroom. I mean, that is important, and there are best practices around how to do so. But we have to avoid being cornered into telling people our personal view on things. That's protective too, honestly. But then of course there's self-care, which is crucial. But, finding a place to debrief, with your colleagues. I'm not talking just about exercise and sleeping, like, okay, everyone knows those things, but we do need opportunities to make sense of things with one another. That's a form of self and communal care as well.
Thank you. No, that's a great one. And I think for me, having what I feel like is a form of self-care for me is having friends that I can have those really critical discussions with. It just brings my brain so much health. I'm like, oh, that was great. I love that we can do that. And then we can continue living our lives and being friends and kind of, understanding the world a little bit better. Otherwise, there's not much to respond to, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it goes back to that ability to have these nuanced conversations. Like if you can find some set of friends or colleagues where you can do so. I mean, to be able to truly make sense of what's going on does require a level of vulnerability. I really appreciate that. And those conversations can be filling and fueling and inspiring.
I would love to close this podcast asking you what you are hopeful about in education. Maybe there's a specific initiative that you're working on. Maybe there's something that came up in the research that is transformative for schools or school districts. What's something that you're hopeful about in education moving forward?
I'm hopeful about a lot. But I think I'm most hopeful about the role that education leaders can play in that kind of the larger fabric of our communities and our society. I mean, as hard as it is, and as under attack as we sometimes might feel, I think most community members look to education leaders as like trusted moral leaders, right? As people who are really
Right.
grounded in what is best for children and families, children, the thing that is most precious to us all. And if we can create these spaces, right, for both the adults and the young people to make sense out of our world, um, I think we can find our way through. I think education leaders are, I don't know, the maybe the essential ingredient, you know, to our progress as a society. And I just don't want anyone to forget
That's
that.
awesome.
We need.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. So good to see
Yeah,
you
of
and
course.
talk to
I really
you.
enjoyed this conversation. I feel like it added that part of the nuance that we are trying to get to. And I love the idea of entry to leadership as a focus point. I think it's really important, something I hadn't thought about before taking your course. And now it's something that I think about very often, to be honest. So I'm happy that we had to have this conversation. Thank you.